It began, as so many quiet regrets do, with music. A faint aria seeping through the open window of the Randolph Hotel bar. Not a recording, but someone at the piano, playing as if the world outside had long ceased to matter. I had been drinking alone, a habit that needed no further encouragement. The port was cold, the glass misted, and the hour indecently kind to those who preferred solitude over conversation. The melody I later discovered to be Purcell rose and fell like something half-remembered from a happier time. It was that sort of evening when every sound seemed to belong to another life. Oxford, with its cloisters and cobbled gilt, never truly sleeps. It murmurs, it watches. I had been thinking, as I often did, about the peculiarity of coincidence, how a man can step out of the same pub every night for years and see nothing, until one evening he notices the faintest anomaly and finds a body before dawn. Perhaps that's why I noticed the woman in grey, sitting at the far end of the bar, unmoving except to stir her drink. Not the sort of woman one sees at Randolph alone. Her gaze was fixed on the pianist with the strange intensity of someone waiting for the end of something, a note, a promise, a life. When she rose to leave, the chair barely made a sound. A folded newspaper remained behind. I might have ignored it, had it not been for the way she placed it deliberately, with the page turned to a small headline about a body found near the river, discovered that morning by a jogger. The face disfigured beyond recognition. A man in his 50s. No name yet. I read it twice, slowly. Something about the phrasing troubled me, believing that I had been walking home after visiting friends in Jericho. A modest euphemism for loneliness. Men who died walking home from Jericho often had nowhere else to go. I asked the barman in that tone of unspoken inquiry if he knew the woman. He shook his head, polishing the same glass for too long. She comes in sometimes, he muttered. Doesn't stay long, always leaves something behind. The piano fell silent, abruptly. The player closed the lid and left without applause. The air felt heavier without the music, as if the notes had been holding the place together. I finished my port, and though I had no reason to follow, I found myself walking toward the river. The night had that particular stillness that precedes a storm. Street lamps flickered like faint arguments with the dark. The police tape fluttered faintly by the towpath, already damp with mist. One constable stood guard, the sort who doesn't yet know how to hide discomfort behind indifference. He recognized me, nodded, and said something about the detective in charge being called away. There was little to see, only the faint indentation where the body had been lifted, and a scatter of footprints that the recent drizzle was already erasing. I stood there a long while, wondering not about who the man was, but who had cared enough to kill him. It's an odd inversion of logic in Oxford. To be murdered is often the only proof one existed at all. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. Faint, improbable, drifting from the opposite bank. The same tune from the piano, someone playing quietly, as if to themselves. I crossed the narrow bridge near Folly Bridge, the sound leading me past shuttered boathouses and the scent of wet timber. A window glowed in one of the smaller colleges, a room lit too late, a curtain half drawn. The music faltered, then stopped. For reasons I could not explain, I noted the rhythm of the closing chords. Not quite the same as before. A hesitation on the third bar, a discordant pause as though the player had forgotten or altered it deliberately. It was a detail small enough to ignore, and yet it fixed itself in my mind like a misplaced comma. When I returned to my flat later that night, the port's warmth had long fled. The newspaper lay on my desk, its ink smudged by the damp. I looked again at the headline and, in the margin, saw something faint, a line of handwritten music, barely legible, penciled in beside the story. The first notes of the same Purcell tune, a coincidence, perhaps, or a message for someone who listened too carefully. Either way, I poured another glass and played the tune softly on my old gramophone. Somewhere between the second and third bar, I found myself hesitating exactly where she was. And that, I think, was when the case began. Anselm College has never loved visitors. Its gates, black and narrow, seem designed to discourage curiosity, and its walls have absorbed too many whispered confessions to welcome new ones. I had been there once before, years ago, for an inquest that left everyone pretending not to remember. Returning now, under a low grey sky, I felt that same resistance in the air as though the stones themselves disapproved of inquiry. Lewis said little on the way in. He had always been uneasy around the colleges, their silence, their self-importance. He parked by the chapel arch and waited, lighting a cigarette he didn't enjoy. I told him to stay. He was glad too. Inside, the porter's lodge smelled of dust and furniture polish. The man behind the desk had a face like an old ledger ruled, precise and faintly accusatory. He looked me up and down, not quite impolite. Superintendent? No, I didn't think so. He hesitated before handing me the visitor's book, its pages filled with meticulous signatures, some elegant, some barely legible. I noticed one name, faintly erased and written again, slightly askew, Claire Davenant. It was a woman from Randolph. The master of Anselm received me in a room that seemed to have been built for regret books, rising like walls around a desk, littered with papers and the remains of a breakfast untouched. He was an old man, not frail, but tired, with that particular expression scholars wear when knowledge has failed to comfort them. He spoke softly, almost apologetically about the dead man. Geoffrey Fielding, a visiting lecturer in Renaissance poetry. Stayed for a term, then stayed longer. No family in Oxford. No enemies either, so far as anyone would admit. I asked if he was musical. The master looked surprised, then smiled faintly. I played the organ once, years ago. Why? I told him I'd heard a piece of Purcell played badly the night before. He said that seemed to describe most organists. It was an easy deflection, but I noted the faintest pause before his smile. Fielding's rooms were on the second floor of the south wing. They were tidy in the way of men who do not expect visitors. A single glass on the sideboard, 2 books open on the desk, Don's sermons and a volume of crossword puzzles. The latter caught my eye. Page after page filled in his neat, angular hand. One clue unfinished. A tune remembered wrong. 7. He had written ruinous crossed it out, then written it again. I found myself saying the word aloud, softly, as if testing its truth. Ruinous. Not the right answer, I thought, but close enough to be a confession. A photograph sat on the mantelpiece. The same woman, Claire Davenant, standing beside him in front of a concert hall somewhere. She was younger, perhaps 10 years, but unmistakable. The same poise, the same shadow behind the eyes. I slipped the photograph into my pocket before I could decide whether I should. Lewis joined me later, his shoes echoing in the corridor. He said the porter remembered Fielding receiving letters with no return address, always the same handwriting, always faintly scented. He grinned when he said it, expecting me to share the amusement. I didn't. We left as the chapel bell began to ring, slow and heavy. Across the quadrangle, a student was playing something on a violin, hesitant, uncertain, like a rehearsal for sorrow. The notes carried strangely in the damp air, bending around the stone. I paused beneath the cloister, listening. There was something about the phrasing of the same hesitation in the third bar that I had heard by the river. The same error, or perhaps the same intention, a signature disguised as a mistake. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him nothing of importance. He shrugged and walked ahead, his footsteps fading into the mist. As I lingered, I looked once more toward Fielding's window, half obscured by ivy. The curtain stirred slightly, though there was no wind. A trick of the light, perhaps. Or someone watching, as I had been watched before. When I finally left Anselm, the bell had stopped, but its echo followed me down the narrow street, a hollow sound, like something closing behind me. And somewhere, faintly, I thought I heard a woman's voice humming a ruined tune. The Bodleian after dusk is unlike any other place on earth. The air seems older and heavier, as though it has learned to hold its breath. The lamps burn low, and the pages whisper against each other like conspirators. It is the sort of silence that punishes the living for disturbing it. I had gone there that evening not from duty, but from habit. When the world refuses to yield sense, one turns to the comfort of quiet words and catalogued dust. Yet that night, the silence seemed different, purposeful, almost listening. She was there before me. A woman seated by the Latin manuscripts, half in shadow, her face obscured by the slanting lamplight. I might have passed her by had it not been for the movement of her hand, the slow tracing of a line across a page, deliberate and lingering, like a fingertip following a scar. The librarian on duty nodded when I asked who she was. Mrs. Davenant, member of the Bodleian Circle. Music department, though she spends her hours here among the theologians. The librarian spoke in that disapproving tone reserved for those who use books as mirrors. I thanked him and moved on, though I could feel her presence behind me, that subtle awareness one acquires in old libraries where eyes outnumber souls. When I turned again, she was looking directly at me. There was nothing inviting in her gaze, only an odd weariness, as if she were accustomed to being understood too late. She rose, leaving the book open. On her way out she paused, hesitating by the return desk. A small gesture, insignificant perhaps, but it struck me she placed her right hand at the top of her left wrist, as though checking a watch she did not wear. A gesture of waiting, or remembering. When she had gone, I found myself drawn to the table she'd left. The book was a collection of sermons by Anselm, the college's namesake. One passage underlined in pencil, for truth is not in the word, but in the silence that follows it. I stood there a long time, uncertain why the line troubled me so, perhaps because it felt like an instruction. I might have left then had I not noticed the slip of paper marking the page. It was the size of a concert program, folded twice. Inside, a single line of musical notation, the same few bars of Purcell's melody that had haunted the case since its beginning. Except here, one note was missing, deliberately erased. The omission seemed too careful to be a coincidence. I studied it under the lamp in the faint groove where the note had been scraped away. Whoever removed it had done so with a blade, patient and precise. The kind of erasure that meant something only to the one who did it. The library clock struck 8. A few readers gathered their things, moving quietly toward the exit. I remained, turning the paper over. On the back, faint writing in pencil, a single word, ruinous. The same word Fielding had written in his crossword. Lewis found me there later. The lights dimmed to warning. He said the coroner's report had come in drowning, not much doubt about it. He asked what I was doing among the monks and manuscripts. I told him I was listening in silence. He looked at me as if to decide whether I was serious, then shrugged and said there was whiskey waiting in the car. When I followed him out, I turned once more towards the darkened reading room. Through the half-closed door, I thought I saw movement. A figure bent over the table, hands poised above the open book, the faint scratch of a pencil against paper. But when I looked again, the room was empty. Outside, rain had begun to fall, the soft, unhurried kind that blurs the lamps into halos. The streets shone like black parchment, and the towers loomed through the mist like thoughts half-formed. I walked back alone, the folded paper in my pocket. That missing note, the absence of sound, felt more eloquent than any confession. Some truths, I've learned, are best played in silence. High-table dinners at Anselm were, as ever, a performance of civility, the sort that conceals its unease beneath Latin grace and polished silver. I had been invited, rather unexpectedly, by the master himself. A gesture, perhaps, of cooperation, or, more likely, control. One must always remember that the colleges do not open their doors. They permit entry, as one permits air through a keyhole. The hall shimmered faintly with candlelight, the scent of roasting meat mingling with the cold, wet stone. The portraits of long-dead scholars gazed down from the walls with the same suspicion they had likely shown in life. Their eyes followed conversation the way ravens follow carrion. Lewis sat to my left, stiff in his borrowed gown, staring at the array of forks before him as though they were evidence in a particularly intricate case. To my right, a woman introduced as Dr. Whitmore Classics, sharp-eyed, elegant in the way of someone who had stopped pretending to be modest about her intellect. She spoke little, but observed much. Across the table, the master presided with weary formality, flanked by two fellows whose conversation flowed like well-aged port, smooth, meaningless, and intoxicating only to themselves. Between them sat Mrs. Claire Davenant, the musician, the woman from the library, and Randolph, wearing black silk that seemed to resist the candlelight. Her presence silenced the table more effectively than any prayer. The first course was consumed in polite murmurs. It was only when the wine had made its second round that the conversation loosened its collar. Someone remarked upon Fielding his death, his absence, his papers now sealed in the archives. "A tragedy," said one fellow with the tone of a man congratulating himself for finding the correct word. Another spoke of Fielding's lectures on Purcell, of his theory that a man's moral character could be mapped through musical modulation. I said nothing, though I found the thought oddly persuasive. At some point, the master raised his glass to the departed colleague. It was a ritual gesture, devoid of warmth. He spoke of Fielding's contributions, his scholarship, his reserve. Claire's gaze never lifted from the table. Only once did I see her hand tremble slightly against the stem of her glass. A tremor so faint it might have been the vibration of memory. Later, when the port was past, I asked quietly, almost absently, whether Fielding had ever dined at high table. The master's answer came too swiftly. Rarely. He wasn't fond of the ceremony. Dr. Whitmore looked up at that, a flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or guilt. She said Fielding preferred the company of students. A touch too fondly, I thought. The conversation faltered, like a record catching on a scratch. Claire spoke then for the first time, her voice soft, precise. Geoffrey was never fond of company, she said. Not even his own. It was the kind of remark that empties a room of sound. I asked about the tune he'd been studying for the Purcell piece. A minor reconstruction, she replied. He believed it concealed a pattern. I asked, what sort of pattern? She smiled faintly. The kind one finds when one stops listening for harmony. Lewis nudged me then, muttering about the lateness of the hour, the case reports piling on his desk. He wanted to leave, and truth be told, so did I. But before we did, I noticed something. A small card placed beside the master's plate, its corner damp with spilled wine. The menu was printed in the college's usual style, except for one thing, a musical notation in the header, tiny and almost decorative. The same phrase of Purcell's melody, complete with the missing note. It was not merely decoration. It was recognition. As we rose to leave, I caught the master's eye. His expression held that peculiar calm one finds in men who have already chosen which truth they will defend. He raised his glass slightly, a gesture of farewell or warning. Outside, the night pressed close against the stone walls. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant bells. Lewis lit a cigarette and asked whether I'd enjoyed the evening. I told him it was informative, though not in the way its hosts intended. He laughed softly, not understanding. Few ever did. I glanced back once at the golden windows of the hall, glowing like a hearth for ghosts. Somewhere inside, a note of music lingered incomplete, unresolved, waiting, and I began, for the first time, to suspect that Fielding's death had less to do with silence than with the sound that refused to follow it. It was Lewis who found the diary, though he would later insist he hadn't been looking for it. The room had been cleared, boxed, catalogued by the constabulary, every trace of Geoffrey Fielding neatly reduced to property tags and photographs. And yet, there it was, half hidden beneath the lining of a desk drawer, a small leather-bound notebook with a corner worn smooth by habit. We brought it back to my flat that evening, where the light fell weakly across the table, catching in the rim of the whiskey glass. Lewis said I'd best open it. I told him he'd ruin his image of me if I did. He laughed, though not quite naturally, and I began to read. It wasn't what I had expected. Not the feverish confessions of a guilty man, nor the sentimental record of a lonely one. The entries were brief, tidy, impersonal notes of lectures, lists of books borrowed, weather observations. It was the diary of a man attempting to seem ordinary. Until, midway through April, the tone shifted. A single line, written smaller than the rest, the music must remain unfinished. Then nothing for 3 days. On the 4th, another note. She came again. Said the tune isn't mine to alter. Lewis leaned over my shoulder. He asked if I thought she was the woman from the library. I said I didn't think I knew. What I didn't know was why Fielding had chosen that phrase, "the tune isn't mine to alter." It had the ring of something once said and often regretted. I turned the pages carefully. More routine notes followed, then a gap of a fortnight of silence. When the writing resumed, it was different. The hand trembled, the spacing uneven. Purcell's cadence hides something. The missing note, her note, the key. After that, only a date. No words. The day before his death. Lewis asked what I made of it. I said it reminded me of a crossword puzzle one writes for oneself. Not to solve, but to prove it cannot be solved. He looked puzzled. I told him that sometimes the spaces we leave blank tell more than the words we fill. Later that night, after Lewis had gone, I returned to the diary. The last pages were empty, but on the inside back cover, faint impressions remained the marks of something written and torn out. I shaded the paper gently with a pencil. Lines appeared, ghostly and incomplete. I could make out a fragment of a sentence. If she plays it again, I will know. The words seemed harmless enough, but there was something in the phrasing not when, but if. As though he had ceased to believe she would, or wished she wouldn't. I found myself thinking of Claire Davenant's hands at the piano, how carefully they avoided the missing note, how deliberate her hesitation had seemed. Fielding's unfinished tune, her correction of it, or perhaps her warning. Music can be a confession too, only harder to translate. The rain had begun again outside, faint and persistent, tapping against the window like a question without urgency. I poured another whiskey, though the bottle was nearly done. The diary lay open before me, a quiet relic of a man who'd tried in his own austere way to write himself invisible. Near midnight I noticed something small, a faint stain on the inside of the back cover, circular, pale. Not ink, not whiskey either. I touched it, and the scent rose faintly lavender, like the letters the porter had described. Letters with no return address. Letters that always smelled the same. A small thing, easily dismissed. But it linked them to the notes, the music, the scent. A woman's presence written in absence. I closed the diary then. Some things reveal themselves not when they are read, but when they are left unread. The rain continued. Somewhere across the city, a clock struck 1. I remember thinking how Fielding's silence had been so carefully composed, so exact in its omissions, that even death seemed merely another pause in the music. and as I sat there, the faintest echo of that ruined tune began to form again in my head, the melody halting, incomplete, waiting for someone to play the missing note. It was Lewis who first noticed the portrait, though he said he hadn't meant to. We were standing in the antechamber of the master's rooms, waiting while the man himself dealt with a phone call of exaggerated importance. The walls around us were crowded with likenesses, stern-faced benefactors, powdered deans, a century's worth of the university's conviction in its own permanence. Yet one painting, near the window, held the light differently. It was not old, at least, not as old as it pretended to be. A woman's face, half in shadow, the brushwork finer than its company deserved. The plaque beneath read simply, "Claire Davenant, benefactress." Lewis said it couldn't be the same woman, surely. The one from the library, from Randolph. I said nothing. The likeness was clear, but the inscription below the frame claimed the portrait had been painted 15 years ago. The master reappeared, dry smile intact. He spoke of generosity, of endowments and music scholarships, of how Mrs. Davenant's late husband had left a modest fortune to the college. He did not say she had once been Claire Davenant, pianist, nor that she had played Purcell for a man who later drowned by the river. He didn't need to. Oxford's reticence is a kind of courtesy. When we left, the rain had begun again, fine and persistent. Lewis walked beside me, his collar turned up, his mind turning over the contradictions. He asked whether I thought it possible the portrait was altered, painted over and repurposed. I told him that everything in Oxford was painted over. The trick was knowing what color lay beneath. We returned later, after dusk, when the porter's lodge was empty and the great oak doors no longer pretended to guard secrets. Lewis muttered about regulations, but followed. Inside, the college seemed asleep, though it was the wakeful kind of sleep that dreams of its own past. We reached the antechamber with our torches low. The portrait caught the beam like an eye that refuses to close. Up close, the varnish shimmered unevenly. I brushed a fingertip along the lower edge and felt the faintest ridge repair, not recent, but careful. Someone had restored it, or concealed something. Lewis asked what I was looking for. I told him I wasn't sure, only that I'd seen the same compositional trick before, the way the painter had softened the mouth, blurred the edge of the jaw, a deliberate act of restraint, like an apology left half-spoken. The next morning, I visited the college archives. A bored clerk produced the portrait records, dusty and officious. The artist's name, G. Fielding. Commissioned in 2009. Paid from an account held jointly by Geoffrey and Claire Fielding. I closed the file slowly. The dead man had painted her. Lewis whistled softly. He said it explained a great deal. I said it explained nothing at all. That evening I returned to Anselm alone. The master received me with the dignity of a man long practiced in evasion. I asked when the portrait had last been cleaned. He said the college had it restored after Mr. Fielding's death, by request of Mrs. Davenant. I asked who performed the work. He could not remember. He did remember, however, that the original title of the piece had been Claire, at the harpsichord. The plaque had been changed only last year. He watched me carefully as he spoke, and when he realized I had noticed the omission, he smiled the faint, regretful smile of a man who has long ago made his peace with deceit. Outside, in the fading light, I studied the painting again. Beneath the layers of varnish, faint outlines surfaced a second figure, half effaced a man's hand resting lightly on the piano lid, the trace of a white cuff, a hint of shadow where a face might once have been. The portrait had not been repaired. It had been edited. Lewis, arriving late, asked what I saw. I told him only that the painting lied, but gently, that it had been altered not to deceive, but to forgive. He said he didn't follow. I told him few do. As we left, I glanced once more toward the eyes of the painted woman. They seemed to hold a private sorrow, not guilt, but memory. The kind that refuses to fade, no matter how many times it's painted over. That night, back in my flat, I poured a drink and looked again at Fielding's diary. The final page, the torn one, had left a ghost impression that I had missed before. 3 words, faint but legible beneath the lamplight, erase me gently. I closed the book. Outside, the bells began their low lament for the hour. And for the first time I wondered whether the truest confessions were not written nor spoken, but painted only to be buried beneath a later layer of silence. It was raining again that morning, the sort of rain Oxford reserves for its more delicate moods, thin, persistent, almost apologetic. The city seemed to dissolve beneath it, towers softened, roads smudged, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves and tired secrets. Lewis and I were on our way to the solicitor's office, summoned by a call that had interrupted my half-hearted attempt at a crossword. The clue I had been pondering. Inheritance Rewritten 5 now felt vaguely prophetic. The office occupied the top floor of a Georgian terrace near St. Aldate's, a place that smelled of paper, polish, and the slow decay of respectability. Inside, the young, painfully cautious clerk led us to a room lined with filing cabinets that seemed to have outlived their contents. The solicitor, a Mr. Fenton, greeted us with a politeness that had clearly been ironed into him over several decades. He produced the will of one Geoffrey Fielding, deceased, and explained with a lawyer's neutral detachment that a new document had been discovered among his private effects. The original will, drawn up nearly 10 years ago, had left his modest estate to the college music fund. The newer one, dated 3 months before his death, named a single beneficiary, Claire Davenant. Lewis made the sort of sound men make when truth and irritation meet. I said nothing. The air between us seemed to hold its breath. Fenton handed me the second will. The signature was Fielding's, the same angular hand I had seen in the diary. Yet there was something about it that troubled me. The flourish of the final G was heavier, slower, as though the pen had lingered too long. The ink, too, slightly faded at the edges, not old, but diluted. I asked when the document had been found. Fenton said it was delivered anonymously, slipped beneath his office door the previous week. Afterwards, as we stepped back into the rain, Lewis said what I had been thinking if the will was real. Claire stood to gain everything. I told him people rarely kill for money alone. He asked what else there was to kill for. I said to be remembered correctly. He didn't reply. That afternoon I walked to Anselm. The porter, looking unusually alert, informed me that Mrs. Davenant was in the chapel. I found her sitting near the back, her head bowed, not in prayer but in something quieter. Exhaustion, perhaps, or acceptance. The air inside smelled of wax and stone. The candles guttered slightly in the draught, and I thought of the portrait again, her painted face staring out through layers of silence. I sat beside her without a word. She spoke first, saying she had heard about the will. She claimed not to have known of its existence, and when she said it, her voice neither trembled nor defended itself. I asked if she had seen Fielding in the weeks before his death. Only once, she said. He wanted me to hear a final version of the Purcell piece. It was dreadful. He was trembling. I told him to stop before he ruined it entirely. Her eyes met mine then, steady and unreadable. He wanted forgiveness, she said. I gave him silence instead. Outside, the rain had ceased, though the clouds remained. Lewis was waiting by the gate, his impatience disguised as concern. He asked what she'd said. I told him only that she played the tune wrong, and perhaps that was what had saved her. He frowned, muttered something about my fondness for riddles, and started the car. On the drive back, I thought about the signature again, the hesitation in the pen stroke, the ink thinned as if by water. Fielding had been drinking that evening, and the coroner had noted the alcohol in his blood. But water could mean something else. Tears, perhaps. Or rain. It came to me then, faintly but with the certainty of a long-sought word. The missing note in the Purcell melody, the one she always left unplayed. It was the same letter as the one omitted from his will, a single, absent E. The difference between Clara and Claire, between truth and correction. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. I remember the crossword clue later that night, the one I had left unfinished. Inheritance rewritten. 5. The answer, of course, was motive. There are evenings when the smallest things return to trouble the mind. A note played wrong, a face glimpsed too briefly, a word crossed out in haste. For me, that evening, it was a crossword. Fielding's old puzzle book had been sitting on my desk for days, its pages warped slightly from the damp. I had turned to it often, not from duty, but from something less defensible, the quiet pull of unfinished patterns. Lewis had once said that my fondness for crosswords was just another way of refusing to rest. Perhaps he was right. But there are truths that emerge only when one stares long enough at a grid. The clues were written in Fielding's neat hand, his answers precise, almost pedantic. He had been a man who believed in order, who sought it even where none existed. Yet several clues near the end had been left incomplete, each with faint pencil marks beside them, like the first attempts of a man uncertain of his own mind. One clue drew my attention: composer's deceit. 7. He had written the word Purcell in the margin, then erased it, leaving a faint ghost of the letters. Below it, he had written silence, also crossed out. There was something deliberate about the indecision. A man like Fielding did not doubt his own answers. He only disguised them. I stared at the clue until the letters began to shift. Composer's deceit. 7. A deceit, a lie, a trick, a false note. 7 letters. Prelude. Not too innocent. Cadence. No. And then it came, quietly, as most truths do. Anagram. I checked the grid. The intersecting answers formed the word perfectly. Anagram. I wrote it in, and only then did I see what Fielding had done. The following clue, one I had not noticed before, read simply, her name. Rearranged 5. Lewis would have said coincidence. He often does. But coincidence has a way of aligning itself with guilt. The intersecting letters, C-L-A-R-E, spelled out a name I could not unsee. I closed the book, perhaps too quickly. The sound echoed in the stillness of the flat. Outside, rain whispered against the window. I sat back and let the silence form its own argument. Fielding had hidden her name in the crossword, disguised as play, as art. But the placement of the clue just before the blank final page made it something else, entirely an act of remembrance, or accusation. The next morning, I took the puzzle to Lewis. He looked at it for all of 20 seconds before saying it meant nothing, that people see patterns where they need them. I told him he was probably right. He asked why I didn't sound convinced. I said I rarely did. Later, in Anselm's library, I asked the archivist for the crossword pages published in the Oxford Mail during the week of Fielding's death. She returned with a folder, indifferent to the fact that she was placing a man's last thoughts into my hands. I scanned them idly, though I knew what I was searching for before I began. In the puzzle dated the day before his body was found, the solution spelled out a phrase running diagonally across the grid: erase me. A coincidence, again, or a confession too fragile for words. That evening, I walked down to the river. The path was slick with rain, the air thick with that peculiar quiet that follows a storm. I stopped at the spot where his body had been found. The river moved with unhurried certainty, carrying with it every secret Oxford had ever refused to keep. I thought of Claire Davenant's hands on the piano keys, of her voice when she said she had given him silence. I thought of Fielding's trembling script, the erased word, the missing note. It was all the same gesture, omission as language. the spaces between things louder than what filled them. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke blur into the damp air. Somewhere, far off, the college bell began its slow toll. It struck me then that every crossword, every melody, every crime was built on the same principle, meaning born from absence. Fielding had not written his confession. He had crossed it out, and in doing so, he had told me everything. It was one of those nights when Oxford seemed to hum with secrets. The air hung damp and metallic after rain, the kind that lingers too long on stone. I had no business being in the music hall of that hour. Yet there I was, a trespasser among ghosts, guided more by instinct than reason. Lewis would have called it intuition. I called it insomnia. They were rehearsing in the next room a student ensemble, all nervous energy and imperfection. Through the half-open door, a violin hesitated over a phrase, faltered, began again. The sound was raw, but earnest. I lingered, unseen. And then it came, that familiar motif from Purcell, the one that had threaded through the case like a recurring sin. Only this time, the missing note was not missing. It was played confidently, beautifully, and the effect was startling. I felt it before I understood it, a shiver of wrongness. Fielding had insisted that note be omitted. Clare, too, had left it silent, always. Yet here it was, restored. Bold as confession. When the music stopped, I entered. The young conductor, startled, said the piece had come from an old manuscript found in the college archives. He gestured to it, resting open on the piano. The ink was faded, but the notation was clear. In the margin, faint pencil markings, corrections, revisions. One phrase circled twice. Beneath it, in a small trembling hand, play it true this time. I traced the letters lightly with my finger. The handwriting was Fielding's. Lewis arrived soon after, his expression the usual mixture of curiosity and disapproval. He said I looked as though I'd seen a ghost. I told him perhaps I had. I showed him the score. He said it didn't prove much. I said it proved enough. We walked back through the empty quad, our footsteps echoing against the wet flagstones. He spoke of the coroner's report again, of the will, of how none of it quite fit. I let him talk. My thoughts were elsewhere, with the melody still lingering in the air, and with the memory of Clare's hands at the piano. She had always paused before that note, as if frightened of its consequence. Perhaps she had known. Later I found her in the hall, sitting alone by the window. The rain had returned, faint against the glass. She didn't look surprised to see me. She said she'd heard the students play, that the sound had carried across the quad. She asked if I'd noticed the difference. I told her it was impossible not to. She nodded. He wrote that version for me, she said, the one with the silence. He thought some truths were better left unplayed. I asked what the truth was. She smiled faintly, her reflection trembling in the glass. That he loved something he couldn't forgive. Or perhaps someone. The clock in the corridor struck 9, though the sound felt older, slower, as if it belonged to another century. I asked whether she had seen the altered score before. She hesitated, then said no. I didn't believe her, but the lie was tender, almost protective. Some lies are told to keep the past from collapsing entirely. As I left, she called after me softly, but with a kind of finality. "Inspector," she said, "do you ever wonder whether silence can be cruel?" I said it often. She turned back to the window, and her reflection vanished in the dark. Back at my flat, I played the melody once more on the gramophone Fielding's recording, warped now by age. I followed the notes as they stumbled toward the pause, waiting for the absence, the fragile breath before the unspoken. But this time, I heard it differently, not as an omission, but as resistance, the refusal to complete what should never have begun. I poured a whiskey, though it did little to steady the thought forming quietly in my mind that perhaps it had not been guilt that kept Fielding's hand from the final note, but mercy. The dead forgive us in strange ways through the things they choose to leave unfinished. Outside, the rain fell harder, drowning the faint music of the city. I let the record spin out into silence, and for a long while I sat there listening to the sound of nothing, playing perfectly. It was late afternoon when the light began to die in the cloisters that narrow hour between day and its forgetting. I'd walked there often in the weeks that followed, tracing the same path beneath the vaulted stone as if repetition might unlock meaning. There is comfort in old architecture. It knows how to keep secrets and how to bear silence without resentment. I hadn't expected to find her there. Claire Davenant stood near the far arch, her face turned toward the stained glass that caught what little light remained. She looked almost spectral, less a woman waiting, more a memory rehearsing itself. She said my name without turning. Her voice was quiet, as if it had traveled a long way to reach me. I told her she should not have come back to Anselm. She smiled at that, not defiant, merely tired. Some places, she said, call you whether you answer or not. I told her the students had begun performing Fielding's reconstruction of the Purcell piece. She nodded once. They always preferred the wrong ending, she said. Then, after a pause, she added, perhaps that was my fault. We walked the length of the cloister together. The air was cold and smelled faintly of rain and wax polish. Our footsteps echoed in uneven rhythm, like the hesitant bars of a duet no longer remembered in full. She asked if I still believed Geoffrey's death was deliberate. I said belief was too strong a word deduction, perhaps, less so. There was no struggle, no cry, no note, but there was a pattern of omission, repetition, revision, and men like Fielding never edit by accident. She stopped walking. You think he killed himself. I think he orchestrated it. There's a difference. She turned to me then, eyes pale in the half-light. You think I drove him to it? I told her I thought nothing. Thinking, I said, had very little to do with truth. She looked away, toward the chapel door, where the last of the sun broke across the flagstones in fractured gold. For a long while, neither of us spoke. When she did, her words came slowly, like notes struck carefully to avoid the wrong harmony. He was painting again, she said. Not portraits this time, studies of color, of decay. I told him it was dangerous to keep returning to the past. He said the past was the only thing that stayed still long enough to paint. That was when I knew he'd begun to plan it. I asked how she could be certain. Because, she said, he had started to hum the tune backward. It was such a small thing, absurd almost, yet it struck me with the quiet inevitability of proof. Fielding's melody, the one with the missing note reversed, would place that silence at the beginning, not the end. A prelude, not a pause. He had inverted his own confession. I said nothing of this aloud. Some deductions feel indecent to speak. The rain began then, softly at first, pattering against the glass, gathering insistence. She looked up as though expecting absolution. There was none to give. He sent me a letter, she said. It arrived the morning after. I burned it without opening it. I asked why. She closed her eyes. Because some words, once read, make silence impossible. The wind moved through the cloister, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone and old lilies. I thought of all the things that might have been written in that letter. Confession, accusation, forgiveness, and how each would have sounded the same once the paper caught fire. When she left, she did not say goodbye. The sound of her steps faded into the rain, and I was alone again beneath the arches. I stood there until the last light drained from the windows, thinking of Fielding's tune, of the way it began now with absence rather than ending in it. Lewis found me later, leaning against the cold stone. He asked if she had confessed. I said she had her way. He frowned, waiting for clarity I had no wish to offer. Some confessions, I told him, are made not in words, but in what they choose to leave behind. He said I looked tired. I told him Oxford has that effect on the living. That night in my flat, I wrote a single line in my notebook before closing it again. All music ends in silence, but not all silence ends in peace. The rain continued until dawn. There are nights when Oxford seems to fold in upon itself, streets dissolving into water and memory, windows weeping light into the dark. That evening, the rain had begun early, slow at first, then insistent, turning the pavements slick and uncertain. I had walked from the station without an umbrella or intention, only the vague need to move, to let the city speak in its old, wet dialect. Lewis had gone home hours before, muttering about reports and early mornings. I envied him that uncomplicated fatigue. My own restlessness felt heavier, like a crime without motive. The bells of St. Mary's struck 9. Their echo bled across the rooftops, soft and patient. Somewhere beyond Magdalen, a choir was rehearsing faint voices, half lost in the rain. Even through the distortion of distance, I recognized the melody. Purcell, of course. Always Purcell. The same fragile thread winding through the whole case, binding the dead to the living, the silence to its echo. I crossed Radcliffe Square. The cobbles shone black as mirrors. The air smelled of iron and lilies, the scent of old funerals. I paused beneath the archway of the Bodleian, watching the water gather in slow rivulets along the stone. A porter swept by with his hood drawn low, nodding to me without surprise. Oxford learns not to question men standing alone in the rain. When I reached Anselm, the gates were locked. I knew the side entrance by habit, an unassuming door near the kitchens, its lock so worn it might as well have invited trespass. Inside, the corridors breathed their usual gloom, the faint hum of radiators, the sigh of wet shoes against tile, the ghosts of arguments once whispered beneath portraits. I went first to the chapel. Empty, as I expected, except for the smell of candle wax, dust and rain leaking through the stonework. The piano remained in its place beneath the stained glass. I sat. My fingers, never precise, found the first few notes of Fielding's unfinished composition. It wavered in the air, hesitant, like a confession reconsidered halfway through, and then, from somewhere above a soft sound, almost imperceptible, a footstep, slow, careful, the cloister stair. I rose, the sound of my own breathing louder than it should have been. The stairwell was narrow, spiraling upward toward the gallery. The air grew colder with each step. At the landing, I saw Claire Davenant standing before the portrait, the same one Fielding had painted, the one she had renamed and restored and tried, unsuccessfully, to forget. She turned as though she had been expecting me. There was no surprise in her eyes, only resignation, pale and still. "He painted me as he wanted me to be," she said quietly. Then he realized he preferred the version that lied. Her gaze moved to the window, where rain traced thin silver lines across the glass. I told her the students had performed the corrected version of the piece that week, that they'd added the missing note. She smiled faintly. "Then it isn't his anymore," she said. Silence filled the space between us, the kind of silence that feels almost sentient. "He left me everything," she said. "The will, the portrait, the tune, but not forgiveness. That he took with him." There was something final in the way she said it. I asked whether she regretted not reading the letter. Her hand tightened around the edge of the frame. "If I had read it," she said, "I might have understood him. And if I had understood him, I might have gone after him." Outside, thunder rolled, distant but deliberate. A draught swept through the hall, carrying the smell of rain and the faint echo of the piano below. She turned away, her reflection trembling in the glass, and for a moment it seemed as if the woman in the portrait had stepped out to join her two versions of the same sorrow, meeting at last. I left her there, standing beside her painted self, the sound of rain falling like applause for something neither of us wished to witness. Back in the quad, puddles reflected the lamplight like broken constellations. I paused beneath the archway once more, looking toward the river, thinking of Fielding's last night. The water, the silence, the erased note now restored by strangers. Oxford was always better at remembering its tragedies than forgiving them. When I reached home, I poured the last of the whiskey. On the desk lay Fielding's crossword book, open to a half-finished grid. One clue remained: blank sound of rain on stone 4. I wrote the answer without hesitation: echo. Then I closed the book and listened. The rain had stopped, but the sound remained.